The 19th of February, 1945, inside the defense zone of the 26th Tank Regiment on Iwo Jima, Colonel Baron Takeichi Nishi waits in black volcanic ash while the first American landings begin below him. The air carries sulfur and dust. Around him, tanks are buried into the island and turned into fixed guns, their steel sunk into a fortress of rock, earth, and hidden fire. Nishi remains in command of the regiment assigned to help hold the island, and the position around him still belongs to an organized defense that believes the assault can be made to bleed and stall. He is no anonymous officer sealed underground. He is an aristocrat, an army colonel, and the Olympic champion who won individual gold in Los Angeles in 1932. On this morning, he does not withdraw, and he does not wait for open ground that will never come. He holds with the weapons he has, inside a defense built to make the invader pay for every yard. A world-famous rider is buried beside immobilized tanks in volcanic rock, and he is still on the side that believes the island can hold. But the force already closing on him was not a single blow. On Iwo Jima, under Operation Detachment, coordinated American ground operations were about to reduce one defended sector after another until Nishi's ground space disappeared. Between the 19th of February and the 26th of March 1945, the battle would run to its end, and by about the 22nd of March 1945, Nishi would be dead in the island's defense. That is the shape of what waits for him. Not a dramatic charge, not one clean duel between famous men. His regiment will cease to matter as a mobile armored force, his sector will be crushed, and his name will vanish into a tunnel war fought yard by yard under a sky he can no longer control. The stakes on that first morning are larger than one colonel, even one as recognizable as Nishi. Iwo Jima is a small island with a huge burden placed on it. The Japanese garrison stands at about 21,000 troops at the beginning of the battle, and Nishi's 26th Tank Regiment is part of a defensive system ordered to make that ground cost more than the Americans can bear. The belief is simple and severe. If the island can bleed the land in long enough, if every fortified position can keep firing long enough, the assault can be slowed, damaged, and punished until the price itself becomes a weapon. That belief gives shape to everything around him. Tanks that should move are buried. Strong points are prepared in concealment. Ground is measured not in distance, but in how long it can be held under pressure. The island does not offer open country for sweeping armored action. It offers compartments of rock, ash, and blasted ridges where every weapon must survive long enough to kill from cover. For Nishi, command on Iwo Jima means accepting that armor has been forced into the logic of fixed defense. That is why his presence matters. A man known far beyond the army is now tied to a position that must prove the Japanese defense can still dictate terms to an American landing. His title gives the moment an edge, but title alone does nothing here. What matters is that he commands real steel, real crews, and a sector inside a real plan to hold. On the 19th of February, that plan has not failed. The defensive system still exists. The hidden positions are intact. The Americans are only beginning to come ashore. From the Japanese side, the opening hours can still look like confirmation. The defenders are not required to win the shoreline in one rush. They are required to make the island itself fight. Every buried gun, every concealed opening, every fixed weapon that survives first contact extends the life of the defense. Nishi's command sits inside that expectation. His tanks do not need room to roam in order to matter on the first day. They need fields of fire, protection, and time. And time, at first, still seems available. The defense has depth. It has concealment. It has officers who believe disciplined resistance can turn terrain into attrition. Nishi's sector is one part of that larger wager. And the wager is not irrational. The island is hard ground. The fortifications are real. The men in them are waiting for an enemy forced to advance under fire toward prepared positions. From inside such a system, certainty does not sound like boasting. It sounds like endurance. The command can tell itself the same thing every fortress tells itself before it is tested. Hold long enough, and the attacker will break on the cost. The staff can cling to the fact that the defenses are still organized, still armed, still concealed where they need to be. Then the arithmetic answers them. The battle will last from the 19th of February to the 26th of March, 1945. By then, Nishi is still inside the same island, and the ground around him is already changing. While that belief still held, the battle kept moving through the same poison landscape that had made fixed defense seem so strong. Black ash swallowed boots and tracks. Sulfur hung in the air. Beneath the surface, the Japanese world remained layered and hidden, with crews sealed into positions that had been prepared to survive bombardment and keep firing after the landing began. Nishi's regiment occupied that world with the rest of the island garrison, its tanks no longer a striking arm in open country, but weapons embedded in a shrinking battlefield. Nothing in the morning told the defenders to think of themselves as finished. They had cover, they had prepared ground, they had a command structure that still functioned. On the Japanese side, the island was supposed to impose delay, casualties, and exhaustion. A buried tank, if it could still fire, was proof that the defense remained alive. A concealed position that survived the opening violence was proof that the island could still punish anyone crossing it. So, the work of holding continued. Men stayed underground until they were needed. Weapons remained hidden until the right moment. The defenders fought from prepared positions rather than exposing themselves to wasteful movement. Nishi's command did the same thing every fixed force must do when mobility is gone. It tried to turn concealment into staying power, and staying power into time. But the ground war was already making a different kind of demand. American pressure did not end with the beach. It kept entering the defended space and turning survival into confinement. The more ground the Japanese lost, the less useful buried armor became. A tank converted into a strongpoint could still kill. It could not recover room once room was gone. That is the change that mattered around Nishi long before his own end arrived. A regiment built around armored force was being held inside terrain that denied armor its natural purpose. Every day the battle remained on fixed terms. His command was being forced deeper into a role it had not been built to escape. Not because the tanks vanished at once, and not because the defense stopped fighting, but because a position can remain lethal even while the space that gives it meaning is being cut away. The island itself tells the story. The battle was being fought over ground tied to airfields the Americans had come to seize, and every push through those zones tightened the shape of the Japanese defense. The fortress was still dangerous. It was no longer broad. Men inside it could feel that difference before they could name its consequence. Lines that looked solid on a map became pockets. Distance became isolation. Concealment became entrapment. That is why the confidence of the first day matters. It was not fantasy. It rested on fortification, discipline, and a willingness to die in place. Nishi's sector belonged to all of that. He was still a colonel with a regiment. He was still inside a defense meant to hold. But once armor is nailed to volcanic ground, every loss of space becomes permanent in a new way. The defenders could still tell themselves the island was taking a terrible price. They could still trust buried steel, hidden fire, and the hardness of the terrain. Then the island answered in dimensions they could not reverse. It held about 21,000 Japanese troops at the beginning, and only so much ground for them to stand on. Behind Nishi's rank and title stood an older life that made his presence here harder to forget. That older life began far from sulfur and buried steel. In 1932, in Los Angeles, Baron Takeichi Nishi became the first Japanese rider to win Olympic gold in the individual equestrian jumping event. He did it on Uranus, and the victory traveled far beyond cavalry circles. Japan did not just gain a medal. It gained a public figure whose title, uniform, and horse made him instantly legible at home and abroad. By the time he arrived on Iwo Jima as commander of the 26th Tank Regiment, he carried two identities at once. He was a colonel of armor in a Pacific Island defense, and he was still the aristocratic champion people remembered from the Olympic field. That is what made his posting matter. A remote island officer could disappear into the garrison. Nishi could not. He belonged to the Kazoku, the Japanese nobility, and he had been trained first as an army officer, and cavalrymen before the war pulled him into a different machine age. The distance between those worlds was hard to miss. In one, he had cleared fences before a crowd in California. In the other, he commanded tanks on a volcanic island, where movement itself had been taken away. The legend was not sentimental. It had a rank, a regiment, and a public face. The 8th of December 1941. When Japan entered the wider Pacific War, cavalry glamour no longer decided anything. Engines did. Armor did. By 1945, Nishi's authority rested on command inside the Imperial Japanese Army, under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's island defense. On paper, a tank regiment meant mobility, shock, and local counterattack. On Iwo Jima, it meant something harsher. Tanks were dug in, concealed, and assigned fixed fields of fire inside a defense built from caves, bunkers, and covered positions. The island had no broad interior for armored maneuver. It offered ridges, ash, rock, and kill zones measured in yards. Kuribayashi's method gave that distortion its logic. He did not need a dramatic charge on the beaches. He needed a layered defense that could survive bombardment and keep exacting loss after the landing. In that system, buried armor was not wasted armor. A tank hull and defilade, a gun protected by rock, a crew firing from concealment after the first shock, all of it served the same purpose. Hold fire. Stay hidden. Make the attacker come forward into prepared ground. On a small island, static steel could still be deadly if it remained alive long enough. And from the Japanese side, there was reason to trust that method. Fixed weapons had worked before in island defense. Concealment had value. Discipline had value. So did a commander who understood prestige and obedience. Nishi did not need to be a romantic figure to matter to his men. He needed to be a colonel in command of crews who had to endure bombardment, wait under cover, and fire only when the target justified exposure. In that world, temperament counted as much as celebrity. By February 1945, his reputation had reached its full wartime shape. He was no longer remembered simply as the rider from Los Angeles. He was the Olympic champion now fused to a buried armored command inside one of Japan's most important island defenses. The irony was complete. A man once known for movement was now feared through immobility. A cavalryman commanded tanks that had become emplacements. And because the method could still kill, nobody on his side had to treat that as humiliation. They could treat it as adaptation. Kuribayashi's defense gave men like Nishi a hard kind of confidence. Stay below the bombardment. Fire from concealment. Make every approach cost blood. If the Americans had to take each position one by one, then fame still sat inside a living machine. A staff officer could look at the prepared ground and say they had done what the island allowed. Then he had to reckon with the count. 1 Olympic gold medal, 1 regiment. The 19th of February, 1945. Motoyama Airfield Zone. The first day looked, in part, like proof. The Americans came ashore, but the Japanese defense did not throw itself away at the waterline. It held back, absorbed the opening violence, and fought from hidden positions that had been prepared for exactly this moment. That mattered. A defense that survived the first bombardment and was still able to fire after the landing had already passed its first test. From inside the Japanese system, restraint was not weakness. It was doctrine working as intended. Nishi's sector fit neatly into that reading. His tanks were not roaming across open ground, but they were never meant to on this island. They had been assigned a narrower purpose. Support the defense from cover. Add gunfire to the fortified belt. Force the attacker to reduce one firing point after another instead of breaking through in a single rush. On the first day, that logic still held. Buried armor remained part of a larger machine that was functioning. The airfield ground made the case stronger. The battle centered on the zones the Americans had come to seize, and those approaches exposed them to concealed fire from a defense built in depth. Caves, bunkers, artillery, and dug-in armor were not separate problems. They were one problem, layered together. If one position survived, it covered another. If one gun was silenced, another could still hold the approach. The island looked less like a line and more like a series of locked compartments. For the defender, that was encouraging. It meant the attack could be delayed repeatedly, not just once. This is why the old method earned one more round of belief. Japanese troops continued to fight from concealed, prepared positions after the landings. They did not need a sweeping counterstroke to feel vindicated. They only needed the Americans to keep paying for forward movement. Every position that had to be attacked separately was evidence. Every hour gained by hidden fire was evidence. Every dug-in vehicle still able to shoot was evidence. The doctrine did not promise beauty, it promised attrition. Yet even inside that confidence, there were signs the island was being read the wrong way. American ground forces did not stop at the first shock. They kept working forward against fixed positions, and they kept returning with support that made each local gain hard to reverse. From the Japanese side, that could still be dismissed as noise. Naval gunfire was expected. Aircraft overhead were expected. Engineers on the ground were expected. None of that, by itself, seemed to disprove the defense. The positions were still firing. The airfield fight was still costing the attacker. So Nishi and the men around him could read the opening phase as confirmation, not crisis. Their side had preserved hidden fire. The shoreline had not produced an instant collapse. Prepared defenses were still exacting a price. Dug-in armor was still relevant. The method that had justified burying tanks on volcanic ground had not been refuted on day one. It had been tested, and it had answered. That is why the first crack mattered so much when it came. Confidence had hardened around a simple belief. If each position remained lethal, then the defense remained effective. A Japanese officer could still say the island was fighting exactly as designed. Then he looked at the map around the airfields and saw the shape changing faster than the guns were going silent. The defenders were still in action, and the space still shrank. 2 airfields. The 20th of February 1945, south of Airfield Number 1. The arithmetic was the first betrayal. The defense was still firing from concealed positions. Dug-in weapons were still dangerous. Yet the Americans had landed on the 19th of February, and by the 20th of February, they had already cut across the island to the western shore. Those two facts did not sit easily together. A fortified system that remained lethal should have preserved depth longer than a single day. Instead, the island had been severed, while many of its firing points were still alive. The kill capacity remained. The space did not. For Nishi's command, that mismatch was brutal. Tanks turned into fixed strongpoints, needed defended ground around them. Once the southern end of the island was cut off, buried armor in one sector could not restore contact with another. A tank gun could still dominate a lane. It could not reopen an island already split. A Japanese officer could tell his crews to hold fast because the positions still mattered. Then he had to say the other thing that made less sense. The enemy had crossed to the far shore in one day, the 16th of March, 1945, northern Iwo Jima. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi responded with contraction, not theater. By that date, organized resistance had been compressed into the north, and the consequence was countable. The surviving defense was now confined to the final sector of an island only 8 square miles in area. That was not morale. That was geometry. Every fixed gun, every tunnel exit, every buried vehicle now had less room to support anything beyond its immediate front. Space had become the missing supply. That reaction mattered because it changed what Nishi's regiment could still be. Whatever armor had once represented in doctrine, it now served inside a narrowing pocket where movement offered almost no recovery. A commander could redistribute men inside the surviving ground. He could not create new ground. Kuribayashi's system was still fighting, still concealed, still dangerous. But by the 16th of March, it was doing so inside a compressed northern zone where static defense had become nearly all that remained. A staff voice in that shrinking world could still insist the line was intact where it stood. Then the island answered with the measure that counted. 8 square miles, the 21st of March, 1945, Northern Battle Area. Colonel Nishi's immediate adjustment was endurance. There was no open field to regain, and no armored role to restore. The concrete consequence was positional. His 26th Tank Regiment remained in the final northern defenses as a fixed element rather than a mobile force. That is a number 2, because a regiment has been reduced to one purpose: hold where it is buried. Nothing in that order could solve the arithmetic already exposed in February. The defense could still kill. It could no longer expand. He could still command steel, crews, and fire. He could not command room. By the 21st of March, the Americans had not removed every gun before taking the next piece of ground. They had taken the ground anyway, and the men under Nishi were still there when it was gone. Early March 1945, around the broken ground north of Motoyama. Nishi's sector was still armed, still buried, and still dangerous. What it no longer possessed was frontage. American infantry, engineers, tanks, and close fire kept biting pieces out of the defense and then holding them, and each bite narrowed the ground on which the 26th Tank Regiment could matter. A buried tank could cover an approach. It could not cover a flank once the flank had ceased to exist. The Japanese tunnel system stretched about 18 kilometers across the island, but by March, that depth was being cut into disconnected fighting spaces rather than one supporting whole. The first loss was concentration. Iwo Jima had been organized to defend the Motoyama airfield complex and the northern high ground together, with one position lending fire to the next. Once the Americans had secured the first and second airfield zones and kept pressing north, Nishi's command lost the ability to mass effect where it chose. Fire still came out of the ground, but from fewer linked directions. A tank hull dug into ash and rock could stay alive for another day. It could not move to reinforce a sector that had already been reduced behind smoke, bulldozers, and direct fire. The regiment remained present. Its freedom to act as a regiment did not. Then came the loss of recovery time. The defense had been built on the idea that surviving positions would keep punishing every advance. What the Americans imposed instead was continuity. A bunker damaged in daylight was approached again. A tunnel exit sealed in the afternoon was tested again the next morning. Nishi's crews and neighboring infantry were not fighting for one crisis at a time anymore. They were fighting a sequence with no reset. That changed orders. Counterfire had to be rationed. Exposed openings had to be abandoned. Some weapons that survived bombardment had to remain silent, because revealing them too early meant losing them before the next push. Men were still alive inside the system. They were already planning around what could no longer be replaced by nightfall. The next subtraction was reach. Underground communication had value only while passages remained usable and neighboring positions still existed. As American ground forces drove north through the airfield belt and into the final defenses, messages had farther to travel through a smaller and more damaged world. Local commanders could still order resistance. They could no longer assume that an adjacent strongpoint was able to answer, or even still there. For a tank regiment turned static, that was crippling. Steel remained in the ground. Command became more local, more isolated, and less able to shape anything beyond the next 100 yards. By the middle of March, the loss had become human. Dug-in armor preserved some protection for crews, but not enough to stop attrition from eating experience out of the defense. Specialists mattered here. Tank gunners, mechanics, signalmen, and officers who understood the island's firing plans could not be replaced from a rear area, because there was no rear area left on Iwo Jima. Every casualty cut more deeply than the number suggested. A fresh rifleman could still hold a cave mouth. He could not restore a tank crew's trained competence once it had been burned out or buried in place. Nishi still had men under command. He had fewer men who could do the exact work the position required. That forced a quieter change. The 26th Tank Regiment's remaining vehicles no longer represented a reserve of armored action at all. They represented fixed points to be spent where they sat. The paperwork logic of that is grimly simple. Hold the gun as long as it fires. Keep the crew in place as long as a position survives. Do not imagine maneuver where the terrain and the enemy have removed it. By then, the fear on the Japanese side was procedural, not theatrical. A local withdrawal meant one less covered lane. A collapsed tunnel meant one less route for ammunition. A silenced gun meant one more approach the Americans would not have to reduce twice. In the last days before Nishi's death, even concealment had changed meaning. Earlier in the battle, it had preserved striking power. Now it preserved fragments. Positions were hidden because exposure meant immediate reduction, not because hidden weapons might support a larger scheme later. The ring had closed that far. Nishi's sector was still part of the northern defense, but it was no longer a defended space with options. It was a diminishing pocket being counted down in entrances, guns, crews, and traversable yards. A Japanese unit in that condition could still tell itself that endurance remained possible. It could not tell itself the ground was coming back. We will fight to the end. About 18 kilometers of tunnels had once tied the island together. By then, they tied together less and less. That was the answer to the mismatch. The Americans were not merely taking positions. They were turning every penetration into a permanent condition by joining reduction, sealing, and immediate occupation on the ground itself. On Iwo Jima, the repeatable element was not one weapon. It was the coordination that kept infantry in contact, engineers opening and closing routes, tanks delivering direct fire, and supporting fires returning on call until a Japanese position stopped functioning as part of a larger defense. That is why the line on the map kept changing faster than the Japanese fire seemed to fade. A position could remain lethal and still be strategically dead. For Nishi and the officers around him, that solved the riddle too late to reverse it. The problem was not that one bunker had fallen or one buried tank had been hit. The problem was that every surviving point was being forced into isolation by a method that came back in the same form the next day. Kuribayashi's defensive system had been built to absorb bombardment and kill from concealment. It had not been built to restore continuity after American ground teams had physically broken the links between positions. Once that happened, each local success by the defender became smaller than the space lost around it. The Japanese adjustment was rational. They contracted. They relied more heavily on the northern cave system. They reduced expectations for movement and treated surviving tanks as static guns inside a final defensive belt. That was not blindness. It was adaptation to a battlefield where mobility had already been taken away. But contraction carried its own arithmetic. Every shortening of the line created density without restoring depth. More men and weapons were compressed into less usable ground, while the Americans could approach those same points with repeated, organized reduction. The defense became harder in the immediate front and weaker in the larger sense at the same time. Another adjustment followed. Fire discipline tightened further. Positions that might once have opened at longer range had to wait for closer targets because ammunition and survivable openings were finite. That too made sense. Yet it handed more initiative to the Americans on the ground. Infantry and engineers could probe, identify, and mark. Tanks could engage apertures directly. Supporting fire could revisit known trouble spots. The Japanese still chose when to reveal a gun. They no longer chose the pace at which the Americans returned to deal with it. Nishi's own command reflected that failure of control. A tank regiment should have offered a commander choices. On Iwo Jima, by March, it offered only placements. Where the gun sat was where it fought. If the approach in front of it was lost, the weapon did not regain relevance by surviving. It simply waited for the next reduction. That is what made the system behind the American advance so destructive to him personally. It did not require dramatic overmatch in 1 hour. It required enough coordination to ensure that each day left him with fewer active relationships between men, weapons, and ground. By the final phase, Japanese command decisions were being made inside a margin that had nearly vanished, hold too rigidly, and positions were sealed and crushed in place. Shift men through the tunnels, and they moved through routes already watched, blocked, or under direct pressure. Commit the remaining tanks more openly, and they gave up the concealment that was the last reason they still mattered. Keep them buried, and they surrendered the last illusion of armored action. Every alternative preserved one asset by spending another. That is where desperation entered, not in one dramatic order, but in the absence of workable choices. The surviving northern defenses had to be held because nothing behind them existed. Nachi and the other commanders in that zone were no longer deciding how to throw the Americans back. They were deciding which pieces of a broken defense could still delay organized reduction for another day. We can do nothing but hold out to the last. By then, the margin had contracted to one northern sector, and no mobile armored force at all. In the days around the 22nd of March 1945, the northern end of Iwo Jima had become a series of hard, shrinking compartments. Nishi was still there, inside the remains of the 26th Tank Regiment sector, but the shape of command had changed around him. There was no operational breadth left to command. There were only positions, survivors, damaged routes, and pieces of ground that had to be contested again whenever the Americans came on. U.S. Marine Corps ground units, with engineers, tanks, and supporting fire, kept closing from one side of the broken landscape to the next. The approach to the end was procedural. One opening reduced, one route blocked, one strong point bypassed, marked, and hit again. For the Japanese side, the last approach did not feel like one event. It felt like compression. A sector lost a tunnel mouth and became smaller. A neighboring gun stopped answering and became absent. A buried vehicle that had mattered as part of a belt became only itself. Nishi's legend offered no exemption from that. He was still a colonel. He was still a baron. He was still the Olympic champion from Los Angeles. None of those facts restored movement to tanks fixed in volcanic ground, or rebuilt continuity between positions already cut apart. By then his command existed where it stood, and nowhere beyond it. The institutional crisis was part of the same ruin. Kuribayashi's method had demanded disciplined endurance from the start, but by late March, endurance meant commanders holding fragments that could no longer support one another in the old way. Orders still moved. Compliance was narrower. A directive to hold a point was one thing. The physical ability of that point to remain connected to the rest of the defense was another. Subordinates in the north were no longer failing because they lacked resolve. They were failing because the defended space that made organized resistance coherent had nearly disappeared. The command structure remained. The ground that justified it did not. Inside that wrecked position, Nishi reached the end that had been building since the island was cut, and the defense compressed northward. About the 22nd of March, 1945, during the fighting in the northern battle zone, Colonel Baron Takeichi Nishi was killed in the defense of Iwo Jima. The exact manner does not need ornament. What matters is the position in which he died. He did not die leading a mobile armored stroke across open country. He died inside a reduced ground system where his regiment no longer existed as an effective armored force, and where coordinated American ground pressure had stripped away the field his tanks would have needed to be anything else. That is the reversal in full. The man who had once crossed an Olympic course on horseback ended under volcanic rock, in a defense whose final problem was not courage but space. His crews had been turned into static defenders. His steel had been made to stand still. His sector had been pressed into a pocket and then overrun as the northern defenses were broken down, position by position. The fall was not theatrical. It was cumulative, and then it was final. The numbers leave no room to soften it. About 21,000 Japanese troops began the battle on Iwo Jima. Only 216 were taken prisoner. Nishi died in March 1945. His regiment did not survive the battle as an effective armored formation. The battle ended on the 26th of March, 1945, with the island in American hands. Those figures matter because they describe what the surviving Japanese officers were commanding at the end. Not a line, not a reserve, not a recoverable defense. A remnant trapped inside the last reduction. For ordinary Americans on that ground, the final work belonged to units, not to one famous enemy. Marine infantry closed in. Engineers dealt with entrances, obstacles, and covered positions. Tanks and supporting fires struck points that still resisted. For the Japanese, in those points, fame disappeared into the same process that consumed everyone else left in the northern pocket. Nishi's own final outcome appears once. He was killed on Iwo Jima in March 1945. Kuribayashi did not save the island. The 26th Tank Regiment did not reappear as a mobile arm. The northern defenses were reduced and then taken. The black volcanic fortress that had once seemed able to punish the landing into paralysis had been cut down to isolated positions and finished at close range. A surviving Japanese voice at that stage could no longer pretend the defense remained whole. The fight has become each cave for itself. 216 prisoners. After that, only